Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called You Shall Not Pass, and the Human Kept the Promise, written by Firefighter Raven. Tribune Aius Rodan, commander of 1,000 bows of the Home Guard, watched the demoralized army of dwarves, elves, humans, and centaurs march towards the remaining bridges over the rushing river. The safety in the city walls was less than a league away. The army had left with banners flying, troops in shining armor, weapons held aloft, drums and bugles announcing their presence to the thousands of civilians watching. The one that returned looked completely different. Banners furled or missing altogether. The cries of the wounded came from dozens of wagons and carts. More wounded limped or were helped by their comrades. And it was far, far smaller than before. An elven naval officer approached with a huge Northman beside him. Rodan didn't know humans got that big, taller than most orcs, and with massive frame. He was wearing a bearskin cloak over chainmail, a long blonde beard, and hair braided in the back. He carried a wicked-looking single-bladed axe. The handle was as long as he was tall. It had a half-moon-shaped blade and a hooked spike on the other side. A shield was slung over his back, cleverly secured to allow the shield to be swung into position in moments. A long sword and dirk was secured to his belt. But it was the eyes that fascinated Rodan the most, wintry blue that bored into you without flinching. "Tedmus Lanyan, captain of Aaron Phoenix," he said, with the casual ease of someone who didn't take military protocol seriously. He waved a hand to the Northman. "This is Leif Gufison, warband leader of the northern kingdom of Hal Yarrow." The big man dipped his head in greeting. Tedmus then turned to speak to the Northman, speaking in familiar language. He heard his name, so he assumed that it was an introduction. Tedmus looked at the Tribune. "He doesn't speak our language," he answered, Rodan's quizzical look. "How many men did he bring?" Rodan asked, with a flicker of hope. Tedmus replied, "About 50. 50? That's all," Rodan felt the brief bit of hope disappear. "Well, any help is appreciated, so thank him for me." Tedmus began to translate Rodan's gratitude when the Northman let out a chuckle. Seeing the look of disappointment on the elf's face, he assumed it was because of how few men he brought. The warband leader laughed and grinned at the elven tribune before addressing Tedmus in his impressively deep voice. "He said that they were just the closest and sent to prepare for when the rest of the Northmen arrive," Tedmus translated. The Northman continued speaking. Whatever it was, it brought a look of relief to Tedmus's face. Tedmus turned to Rodan and said, "Tell the little elf man," his words, not mine, "that the war banners have got out to all the clans, and tens of thousands will answer the call to battle, and the chance to die a glorious death by blade in hand, and the All-Father's blessing." Before Rodan could ask, Tedmus continued, "The All-Father is their most important god, and warriors who fall in battle are said to go to his halls and fight and drink and celebrate every day." It was far different than the elvish version of heaven, but it did sound like a fitting afterlife for a warrior, and it was a very good incentive for them to join the war. Tedmus continued, "He wished to study the situation up close. He wants to gather as much information as possible for the battle chief." Roland nodded and asked. The Northman spoke, his sonorous voice sounding like rocks grinding together. Tedmus nodded, then turned towards Roland. He asked how such a big army was so badly beaten. Roland started to bristle at his words, but then he couldn't deny that. One look at the column, and it was obvious they didn't just lose the battle, but were routed. He heard from an elven captain that there were just too many to hold back. They were almost surrounded and cut off, that it was the charge of the battalion of centaur lancers and archers that briefly threw the enemy back in confusion. It brought the army enough time to break out of the closing trap, but the centaurs paid a heavy price for it, with less than half returning from the rear guard. They bought the army time to pull its shattered units into a semblance of a retreating army and not bands of fugitives running in every direction. He waited while Tedmus translated that for Leif. The Northman replied in that rumbling voice, to which Tedmus answered. He said they are very brave warriors, and may the All-Father welcome them to his halls. While they were speaking, one of the elven general's aides approached and waited to be recognized. The young elf saluted. Roland didn't recognize him, but he was very young. This was probably his first time in the field, Roland thought. But he's going to get an education in a hurry. General Naris compliments, sir, he started. He ordered the dwarven engineers to destroy the last of the bridges as soon as the last wagon is across it. He pointed upstream at a much smaller bridge. That bridge is to remain standing until the last of the rear guard crosses it, and then be destroyed. He wants you to hold the bridge with your archers while that happens, the aide finished. Did he say where these archers are? I left my men on the walls, and I can't do it by myself. The aide's face turned red before he said, I'm sorry, sir, I forgot to say that there was a squad coming from the other bridge since it's coming down, he replied. Roland hid a grin and let the youngster off easy. Tell the general the orders are understood and will be carried out. The aide rode off in a hurry to avoid further embarrassment. The sound of the dwarven engineer setting off the charges made everyone instinctively duck and look as the last of the white bridges fell into the river. The archers arrived soon after. It was a matter of minutes before Dwarven placed the demolition charges under the last bridge, and just in time, too, as clouds of dust announced the rear guard approaching fast. As they got closer, Roland and his men yelled to get the centaur's attention. They turned towards the bridge and thundered across it. It was barely wide enough to allow 2 elves to pass at once, so it forced the centaurs to pass single file. The last of the centaur's rear guard came into view, staying just ahead of the enemy vanguard by stopping several meters ahead of them and firing a volley. They'd then move back as the enemy got close, move back several meters, and stop to fire another volley. Any time the enemy got frustrated and charged, they'd stand their ground and pour arrows into them. As the last of the first group of centaurs cleared the bridge, he unslung a horn and sounded 2 long and 1 short blasts. The rest of the rearguard fired 2 quick volleys and turned to dash back across the river. As soon as the last centaur crossed the bridge, a dwarf pushed the plunger to set off the charges, but nothing happened. Cursing in Dwarven, they began inspecting the detonator on their side and then checking the cord attached to the explosives. A loud baying sound of wargs reached their ears, causing everyone to look up quickly. A double handful of orc warg riders appeared from the forest and sprinted past the enemy infantry. It would be only moments before they reached the bridge. Roland and his archers ran to the end of the bridge and began firing at the warg riders as fast as they could. Unseen by Roland, Leif Gufferson stripped off his bearskin, shield and sword belt. He said something to Tedmus and trotted towards the bridge, unslinging his axe as he went. While Roland and his archers stopped the warg riders, the enemy infantry had the time to close in. Goblins with their spears, orcs in armor and swords and axes already dripping with gore, ogres with spiked clubs over their shoulders were more. Checking his quiver, he found it nearly empty, and a glance said that it was the same for his men. Roland looked towards the enemy in despair, drew his sword, and turned to yell for everyone to run. But the order never crossed his lips, as he saw the big Northmen trotting up to him in Tedmus, trying to keep pace. He touched Roland on the shoulder and shook his head, and then touched his axe to his forehead to salute and strode onto the bridge. The cacophony of noises from the onrushing horde was deafening and forced Tedmus to yell in his ear. He said, "To keep their archers off him!" Tedmus then continued, "He'll hold the bridge until the dwarves can finish the job and buy time for us to get to the city." Roland was shocked, but ordered his men to concentrate fire on any archers. He then watched in disbelief as the human broke into a run and charged the goblins already on the bridge. They came forward with spears aimed at his belly, but he simply brushed them aside and brought his axe down on one, spun their axe sideways and lopped the heads off 2 others. He then jumped through the hole he created and began dispatching goblins in quick succession. Being goblins, they used their favorite tactic of running away, then smack into onrushing orcs that simply ran them over. Roland expected the Northman to retreat, but he stood his ground. He heard the Northman begin to sing as his axe rose and fell, killing any that got within reach. Roland turned to Tedmus and asked, "What is he singing?" "His death song," Tedmus said simply. "He's asking the All-Father to strengthen his hand and grant him a good death. He calls upon him to watch his deeds and take him to the All-Father's halls," Tedmus finished. All of the elves, dwarves, and remaining centaurs stared in awe, as it didn't matter if they were goblins, orcs, or ogres. Anything that came in reach of that wicked axe fell or ran away missing body parts. The river was stained with streaks of red, green, and purple blood. Body parts and gore made the bridge slippery. But still, the Northman stood his ground. Unable to fix the bridge explosives, the dwarves headed upstream past the joining of 2 rivers and to a dam on the river on their side. As the dwarf captain finished explaining their plan, Roland turned to Tedmus. "Tell him to get off the bridge." But Tedmus shook his head. "He won't retreat. He sung the death song, and this only ends in victory or death. Do it! Roland yelled to the dwarf. Another dwarf raised a horn to his lips and blew 3 long blasts. It was only moments before a terrific roar reached them, and a cloud of dust and smoke rose into the air. It only took a few minutes for the wall of water, trees and rocks to come rushing down the river. The force of the onrushing water hit the bridge like a hammer blow, tearing the bridge from the river banks. Anyone on the bridge was thrown into the water to drown in the racing currents. As the last defenders began marching back to the city, Roland kept thinking back to just before the bridge collapsed. Did he really see the human dive into the water just before the water hit the bridge? Or did he imagine it? End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.